Sometimes the most profound discoveries happen when we least expect them. For 68-year-old Hank Mathers, retirement meant quiet days, with only his faithful dog Buck for company. His daughter estranged after years of pride. When Hank stumbled upon an auction for abandoned storage units, he bid $10 on a whim, not for treasure, but something to fill the hours. Inside the dusty unit, beneath forgotten furniture and a broken jukebox, he discovered a shoebox filled with love letters. Letters never sent, never answered, between a woman named Clara and a soldier. What started as curiosity became obsession that would force Hank to confront regrets. But would unraveling Clara's lost love story give him courage to heal his broken relationships? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted the kitchen walls, the same golden shade it had for 37 years. But Hank Mathers felt none of its warmth. He sat at the scarred oak table, fingers wrapped around a coffee mug that had grown cold, while he stared out the window at empty pastures. Buck, his border collie mix, lay at his feet with the patient devotion that had marked their partnership for the past 8 years. "Another beautiful day, Buck," Hank murmured, though his voice carried no conviction. The dog's ears twitched at his name, brown eyes lifting to study his master's face with the uncanny understanding that had always existed between them. Hank twisted the worn gold band on his ring finger, a habit that had intensified since Sarah's death 3 years ago. The ring had grown loose on his weathered hand, just as everything in his life seemed to be slipping away. He'd built this ranch from nothing, raised cattle, worked the land until his bones ached, but what did any of it matter now? The cattle were sold, the fields leased to younger men with stronger backs and bigger dreams. The silence in the house had weight to it, pressing down on his shoulders like a heavy blanket. Sarah used to fill these spaces with humming, with the clatter of breakfast dishes, with gentle scolding about his habit of leaving muddy boots by the door. Now the boots sat in perfect rows, unused, while Hank wore the same pair of slippers day after day. Buck rose and padded to the back door, tail wagging hopefully. The dog understood routine, even when routine had become nothing more than obligation. Hank followed, opening the door to let Buck into the yard they'd once shared with chickens and barn cats. Now it held only memories and the ghost of Sarah's vegetable garden, overgrown with weeds despite Hank's half-hearted attempts to maintain it. The town of Cedar Falls stretched below them, a collection of weathered buildings and tree-lined streets that had changed little in the decades since Hank first arrived as a young man fresh from military service. Back then, he'd been full of plans and purpose, convinced that hard work and dedication would build something lasting. He'd been right about building something. The ranch had prospered, Sarah had loved him, and they'd raised a daughter who inherited her mother's quick mind and her father's stubborn streak. Emma. The name sat in his chest like a stone. 3 years since Sarah's funeral, and he could count on one hand the conversations they'd had. She lived 2 states away now, a successful lawyer with a family of her own, and every attempt at connection had ended in the same familiar pattern of stilted politeness and underlying tension. Hank remembered their last real conversation, the day after the funeral, when Emma had suggested he sell the ranch and move closer to town, maybe into one of those assisted living communities. The suggestion had hit him like a physical blow, and he'd responded with the kind of sharp words that Sarah would have scolded him for. Emma had left the next morning, and their phone calls since had been brief, polite exchanges of health updates and weather reports. He'd been a good father once, or so he'd thought. He'd taught Emma to ride, to fix fence posts, to handle responsibility. But somewhere along the way, his lessons in self-reliance had built walls instead of character. When she'd wanted to pursue law instead of staying to help with the ranch, when she'd chosen a life in the city over the rural traditions he'd valued, he'd taken it as rejection rather than growth. Sarah had tried to bridge the gap, translating between 2 people who loved each other but spoke different languages. Without her gentle intervention, Hank and Emma had drifted apart like boats without anchors. each too proud to admit they missed what they'd lost. Buck barked at something in the distance, drawing Hank from his thoughts. The dog was getting older too, grey creeping into his muzzle, his morning walks growing shorter. The idea of losing Buck's companionship sent a chill through Hank that had nothing to do with the autumn air. He walked back inside, past the living room where Sarah's reading chair still held the indentation of her body, past the hallway lined with photographs that told the story of a life well lived. Emma's graduation photos, wedding pictures, images of grandchildren he barely knew. The children had his eyes, but Emma's careful smile. And Hank wondered if they even remembered their grandfather's name. The kitchen clock ticked toward 10, marking another hour in another day that stretched ahead with the same predictable emptiness. Buck would need his walk. The mailbox would need checking, and there would be a few chores to occupy the time until evening news and an early bedtime. The routine had become both comfort and prison, familiar enough to navigate without thought, but hollow enough to offer no real satisfaction. Hank had tried to fill the void in acceptable ways. He'd volunteered at the church for a while, helping with maintenance projects that required more patience than skill. But the well-meaning sympathy of the congregation had worn thin, and he'd gradually stopped attending Sunday services. He'd considered a part-time job in town, but what could a retired rancher offer that younger, more energetic workers couldn't provide better? The loneliness wasn't constant. Some days passed without the sharp ache of missing Sarah or the regret about Emma, but it was always there, waiting in quiet moments in the space between radio songs, in the pause before sleep. He'd never learned to be alone, having gone from his childhood home to military service to marriage without ever mastering solitude. Outside, the mailman's truck rumbled up the gravel drive, and Buck began his daily ritual of announcing the arrival with enthusiastic barking. Hank watched through the window as Jerry Prescott climbed out, sorted through the mail, and waved toward the house with the casual friendliness that marked small-town relationships. "Morning, Hank," Jerry called as Hank stepped onto the porch. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" "Sure is," Hank replied, accepting the small bundle of bills and advertisements that represented his primary contact with the outside world. "How's your mother doing?" "Oh, you know, Mom, still trying to run everyone's life from her kitchen table." Jerry grinned, adjusting his cap against the morning sun. "She keeps asking when you're going to come by for coffee. Says she's got stories about the old days that you need to hear." Hank nodded politely, though they both knew he wouldn't make the visit. Social calls required energy he didn't possess, and other people's stories only highlighted the absence of new chapters in his own life. After Jerry left, Hank sat on the porch steps with Buck beside him, reading a flyer about a storage unit auction scheduled for the weekend. The idea struck him as both ridiculous and oddly appealing. Spending money on other people's abandoned possessions seemed like the kind of impulse that responsible adults avoided. But responsibility had become a burden rather than a virtue, and the prospect of something unexpected held an appeal that surprised him. He folded the flyer and slipped it into his shirt pocket, not quite ready to commit but unwilling to throw it away. Buck stretched out in the morning sun, content with simple pleasures that Hank envied. Perhaps wisdom lay in such acceptance, in finding peace with what remained rather than mourning what was lost. But as Hank looked out over the land that had defined his identity for decades, he couldn't shake the feeling that acceptance might be just another word for giving up. Somewhere beneath the resignation and routine, a small spark of curiosity flickered, the same instinct that had led him to buy this ranch, to ask Sarah to marry him, to believe that taking risks might lead to something better than safety. The auction flyer crinkled in his pocket as he stood, a small rebellion against the predictable pattern of his days. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that made promises feel possible. Hank found himself dressing with more care than he'd taken in months, choosing his good jeans and the blue flannel shirt Sarah had always said brought out his eyes. Buck watched from the doorway, tail wagging with the excitement that came from sensing a break in routine. "You want to come along, boy?" Hank asked, though the question was rhetorical. Buck was already moving toward his leash with the determined purpose of a dog who recognized adventure. The drive to the storage facility took them through the heart of Cedar Falls, past the diner where Hank and Sarah had shared their first date, past the bank where they'd signed the mortgage papers for the ranch. The town was stirring to life with Saturday morning energy, families heading to soccer games, couples walking hand in hand toward the farmer's market. Teenagers gathered outside the old movie theater with the easy confidence of youth. Hank felt simultaneously connected to and separate from the life flowing around him. These were his neighbors, people whose names he knew and whose stories intersected with his own. Yet he moved among them like a ghost from an earlier chapter of the town's history. The storage facility sat on the outskirts of town, a collection of beige metal buildings arranged in neat rows, like a suburban neighborhood for possessions. Already a small crowd had gathered for the auction, retirees like himself, young couples hunting for bargains, and professional resellers with the sharp-eyed focus of people who understood profit margins. Buck sniffed the air with interest, cataloguing the scents of strangers and unfamiliar places. Hank clipped the leash to his collar and joined the crowd gathering around a heavy-set man with a clipboard and a voice that carried across the parking lot. "Folks, we've got 12 units going today," the auctioneer announced. "Same rules as always. Cash only. You buy what you see. No going inside until after you've paid. Any questions before we start?" Hank studied the other bidders, trying to guess their motivations. The young couple near the front whispered urgently about furniture for their first apartment. An elderly woman in a faded coat clutched a purse with both hands, her eyes bright with the hope of hidden treasures. Two men in work clothes discussed the potential value of tools and electronics with the casual expertise of people who'd done this before. The first few units revealed their contents readily: boxes of books, holiday decorations, children's toys that suggested families in transition. The bidding was spirited but predictable, with obvious items drawing obvious interest. Hank watched without participating, content to observe the small dramas of desire and disappointment playing out around him. Unit 7 sat at the end of a row, slightly apart from the others. When the auctioneer rolled up the metal door, the contents seemed to exhale decades of stored air into the morning sunlight. Unlike the organized chaos of the previous units, this one held the careful arrangement of someone who'd packed with intention. A burgundy sofa sat against one wall, its upholstery faded but intact. Beside it stood a wooden dresser with brass handles that caught the light, and in the back corner, partially covered by a paint-splattered tarp, hulked what appeared to be an old jukebox. Boxes were stacked with military precision, each labeled in careful handwriting that was too distant to read. "Now this one's interesting," the auctioneer said, his voice carrying genuine appreciation. "Looks like someone took care with the packing. What am I bid?" The bidding started slowly. The young couple examined the sofa with interest, but were quickly outbid by one of the professional resellers. The elderly woman studied the dresser with the focused attention of someone calculating both need and budget. Hank found himself raising his hand almost without conscious thought. $10, he called out, his voice surprising himself with its clarity. The auctioneer looked pleased. "I've got 10. Who'll give me 20? The professional reseller hesitated, clearly seeing something valuable, but perhaps not valuable enough to justify serious money. The young couple conferred in whispers, the woman shaking her head at whatever her partner suggested. "Going once at $10, the auctioneer announced. "Going twice?" Hank felt Buck shift beside him, the dog's attention focused on something inside the unit that human eyes couldn't detect. "Sold to the gentleman with the dog." The finality of the moment hit Hank with unexpected force. He'd just purchased the accumulated possessions of a stranger, taking responsibility for pieces of a life he knew nothing about. As he approached the unit with his receipt and a $10 bill, he felt like an archaeologist about to disturb a carefully preserved site. The auctioneer moved on to the next unit, taking most of the crowd with him. Hank stood alone at the threshold of his purchase, Buck sniffing eagerly at the entrance. The silence felt respectful, as if they were entering a church or a library. The sofa was heavier than it looked, but Hank managed to wrestle it into his truck with the help of a teenager who'd stayed behind to watch. The dresser required more strategy and an additional trip, but eventually everything was loaded except the jukebox, which would need professional movers and more planning than Hank was prepared for today. It was only when he was boxing the smaller items that he discovered the shoebox tucked beneath a hand-knitted throw. The box was older than the others, its corners soft with age and handling. Unlike the other containers, this one was unmarked, held closed by a rubber band that cracked when he touched it. Buck whined softly, pressing close to Hank's leg as if sensing the significance of the moment. Hank lifted the lid with the careful reverence reserved for fragile things. Inside, nested in tissue paper that had yellowed with time, lay bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon. The envelopes were addressed in feminine handwriting to Lieutenant James Morrison, the 2nd Infantry Division, with return addresses from C. Hartwell at a local Cedar Falls address. But what made Hank's breath catch was the condition of the letters. Pristine, unpostmarked, never sent. Each envelope was sealed, containing words that had never reached their intended recipient. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the first bundle. The paper felt fragile beneath his fingers, and he could almost sense the weight of unspoken emotions contained within. The return address was from Maple Street, just 6 blocks from where he now stood. Buck settled beside him with a soft sigh, as if understanding that this moment required patience and quiet. The auction continued in the distance, voices and laughter providing a backdrop to Hank's private discovery. But the sounds seemed to come from another world. Hank carefully returned the letters to their box, securing the lid with a gentleness that surprised him. Whatever stories these letters contained, whatever love or regret or hope they held, they deserved more than casual curiosity. They deserved someone who understood the weight of words unspoken and chances missed. As he loaded the shoebox into his truck with the reverence of handling something sacred, Hank felt a stirring in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. It might have been curiosity or compassion, or simply the recognition of kindred loneliness. Whatever it was, it cut through the fog of routine that had clouded his days, bringing a clarity that was both unsettling and oddly welcome. The drive home passed in contemplative silence, Buck riding with his head out the window, while Hank's mind raced with questions about Clara Hartwell and Lieutenant Morrison. He thought of his own unfinished business, his own words left unsaid, and wondered if understanding someone else's regrets might provide the key to addressing his own. The shoebox sat on the passenger seat like a passenger itself, carrying the weight of a story that demanded to be heard. Hank spent the rest of Saturday arranging his purchases in the barn, but his thoughts remained fixed on the shoebox sitting on his kitchen table. Buck seemed to understand the significance of their discovery, staying close to Hank's side with unusual attention, occasionally glancing toward the house as if he too felt the pull of unfinished stories. By Sunday morning, curiosity had overcome reverence. Hank made his coffee stronger than usual, settled into Sarah's reading chair, the first time he'd sat there since her death, and carefully opened the shoebox again. Buck positioned himself at Hank's feet, watchful and patient. The letters were organized in 3 distinct bundles, each tied with ribbon that had once been bright, but now bore the muted colors of age. Hank selected the bundle that appeared oldest, judging by the style of the stationery and the fading of the ink. He opened the first envelope with the care of a surgeon, sliding his finger beneath the flap that had remained sealed for what must have been decades. The paper inside was delicate, covered in the same careful handwriting he'd seen on the envelopes. "My dearest James," the letter began, and Hank felt like an intruder reading words meant for other eyes. But something in the formality of the salutation, the measured quality of the prose, suggested these were letters meant to be preserved, even if they were never meant to be sent. "I write this knowing you'll never read it, but somehow the act of writing makes you feel less far away. The war ended 6 months ago, and still no word from you. Mother says I should accept what the silence means, but my heart refuses such practical wisdom. The letter continued for 2 pages, describing daily life in Cedar Falls during the 1940s, the difficulty of obtaining certain goods, the celebration when the soldiers began returning home, the gradual realization that some would never return. Clara wrote of working at the phone company, of helping her mother with the garden, of attending church socials where the absence of young men made every gathering feel incomplete. But underlying the mundane details was a love so patient and hopeful that it made Hank's chest ache. Clara wrote as if James might walk through her door at any moment, as if the war had merely delayed their reunion rather than ended their future. Hank found himself reaching for a small photograph that had been tucked into the envelope, a studio portrait of a young woman with dark hair and serious eyes, wearing a dress with a white collar that suggested the 1940s. Clara Hartwell had been beautiful in the way that spoke of character rather than mere features, her gaze direct and honest. The second letter, dated 3 months later, carried a different tone. Clara's hope had begun to temper with reality, though she still wrote with love rather than grief. "I visited the Morrison farm yesterday," she wrote. "Your mother was kind but distant. I think my presence reminds her of questions she'd rather not face. She mentioned that Lieutenant Collins from your unit came by last month, but she wouldn't tell me what he said. I suppose some truths are easier to avoid than confront." Hank understood that sentiment more than he cared to admit. How many conversations with Emma had he avoided because facing their problems felt more difficult than maintaining polite distance? The third letter revealed more of Clara's personality. She wrote about returning to college, about her plans to become a teacher, about the struggle between moving forward and holding on to hope. Her words showed a young woman wrestling with the universal challenge of how to live with uncertainty. "I've decided to live as if you're coming home," she wrote. "Not because I'm certain you will, but because the alternative makes every day feel like morning. Perhaps hope is just another form of courage." Buck shifted beside the chair, drawing Hank's attention to the growing pile of envelopes he'd yet to open. The magnitude of Clara's correspondence was becoming clear. This wasn't a brief romance preserved in memory, but a sustained love affair conducted entirely through words that never found their recipient. Hank opened another envelope, this one from the second bundle. The handwriting had evolved slightly, showing more confidence and maturity. The date was 2 years later. "Dearest James, I taught my first class today. 23 children, all curious and restless and wonderful. Mary Patterson reminds me of myself at that age, too serious for her own good, but with questions that demand honest answers. I find myself wondering what our children might have been like if we'd had the chance." The letter continued with descriptions of her teaching experiences, but Hank found himself focusing on that single sentence about children. He thought of Emma as a young girl, full of questions and observations that he'd sometimes been too tired or distracted to fully appreciate. How many conversations had he cut short because ranch work demanded his attention? How many moments of connection had he missed because he'd been focused on providing rather than listening? Clara's next letter contained a pressed flower, still holding traces of color after all these years. "I found this near the creek where we used to walk," she wrote. "Do you remember the afternoon you told me about your dreams of traveling after the war? You wanted to see the ocean, to walk on beaches where the waves never stopped. I pressed this flower in my copy of Whitman, the book you gave me before you left. Somehow, keeping pieces of our time together makes your absence feel less permanent." Hank set the letter aside, overwhelmed by the intimacy of these preserved moments. He was reading the archaeology of a relationship, layer upon layer of devotion and hope and gradual acceptance. Each letter was a small act of faith, written by someone who understood that love doesn't end simply because its object disappears. The afternoon was fading when Hank finally organized the letters chronologically, creating a timeline that spanned nearly 5 years. The progression was heartbreaking in its gradual acceptance, Clara's tone shifting from urgent hope to patient love to something approaching peace. Though she never stopped writing, Buck had remained at his side throughout the reading, occasionally lifting his head when Hank's emotional reactions became audible. Dogs understood grief, Hank realized, even when they couldn't comprehend its source. As evening approached, Hank found himself studying Clara's photograph again. She looked like someone he might have known, someone who could have been a neighbor or friend if their lives had intersected. The thought made her story feel less distant, more personal. He gathered the letters carefully, returning them to their proper order in the shoebox. But as he prepared to close the lid, a question formed that would not be dismissed. What had happened to Clara Hartwell? Had she ever married, ever found happiness, ever stopped writing letters to a man who couldn't answer? For the first time in years, Hank had a mystery that demanded solving, a story that pulled him beyond the borders of his own regret. Clara's love had been preserved by accident, discovered by chance, but perhaps that was exactly what both their stories needed. Someone willing to care about what others had left behind. Monday morning found Hank at the Cedar Falls Public Library before it opened. Buck waiting patiently in the truck, while his master paced the parking lot with an energy that surprised them both. The night had brought restless sleep, filled with fragments of Clara's words and images of a young soldier whose face remained unknown. Margaret Stillwater, the head librarian, greeted Hank with the mixture of pleasure and concern that marked small-town encounters, with hermits emerging from self-imposed isolation. Hank Mathers. "As I live and breathe," she said, unlocking the heavy glass doors. "I haven't seen you in here since—" She caught herself before mentioning Sarah's name, but they both knew when his last visit had been. Sarah had loved the library's local history section, spending hours researching genealogy and old newspaper articles. "Morning, Margaret. I wonder if you might help me with some research." Margaret's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of a librarian presented with a genuine research challenge. "Of course. What are you looking for?" Hank explained about the storage unit, the letters, and his growing need to understand Clara's story. Margaret listened with the careful attention of someone who understood that every question contained its own small drama. "Clara Hartwell," she mused, leading him toward the local history section. "The name sounds familiar, but I can't place it immediately. Let's start with the city directories from the 1940s. The directories were bound in cracked leather, their pages yellow with age. Hank found the Hartwell listing easily. Charles and Ruth Hartwell at 412 Maple Street, with Clara listed as their daughter. The address matched the return address on the letters. The Morrison family would be easier to track, Margaret suggested. If they were farmers, they'd have been in the county records for decades. She was right. The Morrison farm had been a substantial operation in the 1940s, with James listed as the eldest of 3 sons. The record showed his birth year as 1921, making him just 23 when he'd been deployed. Too young for the responsibility of war, too young to die so far from home. "Here's something," Margaret said, pulling a thick folder from a filing cabinet. "We have a collection of local newspaper clippings about World War II servicemen. Let me see if James Morrison is mentioned." The search took an hour, but eventually they found it. A small item from the Cedar Falls Gazette, dated September 1945. "Local man missing in action," the headline read, followed by a brief paragraph about Lieutenant James Morrison of the 42nd Infantry Division, reported missing during operations in the Philippines. The article mentioned that he was the son of Robert and Helen Morrison, and was fondly remembered by friends and neighbors for his academic achievements and service to the community. What the article didn't mention was Clara Hartwell, though Hank suspected that wartime discretion might have protected unmarried sweethearts from public speculation. The formal language of loss couldn't capture what those letters had revealed, a love that had been real and deep and full of plans for a future that would never arrive. "I'm sorry, Hank," Margaret said softly. "It's always hard to read these old war records." Hank nodded, thinking of his own service in Vietnam, of friends who'd come home changed and friends who hadn't come home at all. The wars were different, the enemies different, but the weight of loss remained constant across generations. "Would you mind if I photocopied some of these articles?" he asked. Of course. Take whatever you need. Back home, Hank spread the photocopied articles across his kitchen table, creating a timeline that intersected Clara's letters with official records. The picture that emerged was heartbreaking in its clarity. A young woman writing to a man who'd been dead for months before her first letter was composed. Buck wandered to his food bowl, the ordinary demands of life, providing a counterpoint to the tragedy unfolding on paper. Hank felt grateful for the dog's presence, for the reminder that even in the midst of understanding past sorrow, present life demanded attention and care. It was while organizing Clara's belongings from the storage unit that Hank made his next discovery. Wrapped in tissue paper at the bottom of the shoebox was a small metal object that he almost missed, a military dog tag. The metal blackened with age, but the stamped information still readable. Morrison, James P. 37458 B. 15 Mar 21 RC. The dog tag felt impossibly heavy in Hank's palm. This small piece of metal that had once hung around the neck of a young man, dreaming of oceans and peaceful futures. Somehow Clara had acquired it, whether from his family, from a returning soldier, or through some other connection Hank couldn't imagine. But she'd kept it, preserved it along with her letters, like a relic of interrupted love. Hank closed his eyes, remembering his own dog tags from Vietnam, the way the metal had warmed against his chest during long marches through humid jungles. He remembered the superstitions soldiers developed about their tags, never taking them off, never lending them, treating them like talismans that might carry them safely home. James Morrison's tag had outlived its owner by decades, ending up in the hands of a woman who'd loved him, and now in the possession of a stranger who was beginning to care about both their stories. The chain of custody felt significant, as if Hank had been chosen to serve as witness to something that demanded acknowledgement. That afternoon, he drove past the old Morrison farm, now subdivided into smaller lots with modern houses. The original farmhouse was gone, replaced by a split-level home with vinyl siding and a two-car garage. Only the mature oak trees suggested the property's agricultural past. At the post office, Hank asked Jerry Prescott about the Morrison family. Jerry's knowledge of local history was encyclopedic, accumulated through decades of delivering mail to the same families. "Oh, sure, I remember the Morrisons," Jerry said. "Robert died in the 70s, Helen a few years later. There was a younger son, William, but he moved away after his parents passed. Heard he went to California, but that was years ago. And James?" Jerry's expression grew solemn. "Lost in the war. Real tragedy. Helen never got over it. She used to get letters from the army asking for information, trying to account for missing soldiers. Always hoping for some news, you know. But nothing ever came." Hank thought of Clara, writing letters to a ghost, while James's mother waited for official answers that would never arrive. Two women loving the same absent man, each dealing with loss in her own way, neither knowing about the other's vigil. The drive home passed in contemplative silence. Hank felt the weight of responsibility settling around him like a familiar coat. Someone needed to complete these interrupted stories, to honor the love and sacrifice that had been preserved by accident. Clara and James deserved better than storage unit anonymity. Buck greeted him at the door with the uncomplicated enthusiasm that had always characterized their relationship. As Hank settled into Sarah's chair with the evening paper, the dog positioned himself nearby, seeming to understand that his master's world had expanded beyond the boundaries of routine grief. The dog tag lay on the side table, catching the lamplight like a small beacon. Tomorrow, Hank decided, he would continue searching for Clara's story. But tonight, he would simply sit with the weight of other people's love and loss, allowing their preserved emotions to remind him of what still mattered in a world that often seemed emptied of meaning. The breakthrough came on Wednesday afternoon when Hank was reviewing the last bundle of Clara's letters. Margaret had called with additional information. Clara Hartwell had indeed lived in Cedar Falls for most of her life, teaching at the elementary school until her retirement in 1985. She'd never married, though she'd been well regarded in the community for her dedication to her students and her quiet involvement in various charitable organizations. She lived on Elm Street for her final years. Margaret had told him, "House is still there, though I believe it's rental property now. You might try talking to some of the older residents in that neighborhood." Armed with this information, Hank felt his investigation shift from historical research to something more immediate and personal. Clara wasn't just a figure from the distant past. She'd lived among people who still remembered her, who could speak about her character and habits and the daily realities of a life spent loving a ghost. But first, he needed to finish reading her final letters. The last bundle contained fewer envelopes. Spanning the years from 1950 to 1954, Clara's handwriting had evolved into the confident script of an experienced teacher. Though the underlying emotion remained consistent, it was in this final bundle that Hank discovered something that stopped him completely: an unfinished letter, its ink ending mid-sentence, as if Clara had been interrupted by a thought too painful to complete. The letter was dated December 7th, 1954, exactly 9 years after James had been reported missing. Clara had been 27 years old. No longer the young woman who'd first begun writing to her absent love, but not yet the settled spinster that small towns expected unmarried women to become. "My dearest James," she had written, "today marks 9 years since we lost you, though I've never been able to accept that verb, lost, as if you were misplaced rather than taken. Mother thinks I should stop writing these letters, that the time for mourning has passed, and I should focus on building a real life with real people. She's probably right, but she doesn't understand that these letters aren't about the past. They're about the only future I've ever been able to imagine." The letter continued for 2 pages, describing her work at the school, her satisfaction with teaching, and her growing acceptance that happiness might take forms she'd never anticipated. But it was the unfinished paragraph that made Hank's hands tremble. "I've been thinking about what love means when its object is absent. Is it still love if it can never be reciprocated? Is it devotion or delusion? I watch my married friends struggle with the daily compromises of real relationships, the small disappointments, the gradual accumulation of irritations and adjustments, and I wonder if my love for you is purer because it will never be tested by ordinary life. But I also wonder if I'm using that love as an excuse to avoid the messiness of living, the risk of caring for someone who might disappoint me or whom I might—" The sentence ended there. The pen lifted from paper as if Clara had been called away, or had simply run out of courage to complete the thought. Hank stared at the unfinished words, recognizing something of his own emotional paralysis in Clara's interrupted honesty. How many times had he stopped himself from calling Emma, not because he lacked love, but because he feared the conversation might reveal how much they'd grown apart? How many letters had he started and never sent, emails he'd composed and deleted, words of reconciliation that had died in his throat, because completing them felt too dangerous? Buck approached, sensing distress, and pressed his warm body against Hank's leg. The simple gesture of comfort reminded Hank that some forms of love required no complicated analysis. They simply were, steady and present and uncomplicated by the fears that plagued human relationships. That afternoon, Hank drove to Elm Street, a tree-lined avenue of modest homes built in the 1950s and 1960s. Clara's former house was a white frame cottage with green shutters, well-maintained but clearly occupied by tenants rather than owners. Hank sat in his truck for several minutes, studying the windows where Clara had spent her final years, trying to imagine her daily routines and private thoughts. The neighbor to the left was working in her garden, a woman in her 70s who moved with the careful efficiency of someone managing arthritis. Hank approached with Buck at his side, grateful for the dog's talent for making social interactions feel less intrusive. "Beautiful day for garden work," he said, stopping at the fence line. The woman looked up, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. "Can't complain, though my back isn't as enthusiastic about fall cleanup as it used to be," She studied Hank with the frank assessment of someone who'd lived long enough to judge character quickly. "You're not from this neighborhood." "No, ma'am. I'm Hank Mathers, from out toward the old highway. I was wondering if you might have known Clara Hartwell, who used to live next door." The woman's expression softened immediately. "Oh, Clara, sweet woman. I'm Dorothy Brennan, lived here since 1968. Clara was already established when we moved in, been here for years. Quiet neighbor, but friendly. Always remembered the children's birthdays, helped out when people were sick." "You a relative?" Hank explained about the storage unit and the letters, watching Dorothy's face register surprise and then something approaching wonder. "Love letters?" she said. "Well, that explains some things. Clara never married, you know, though she had plenty of opportunities. Attractive woman, good job, kind disposition. Men asked her out, but she always declined politely. We used to wonder, but she never spoke about her reasons. Said she was content with her life as it was." "Did she ever mention someone named James Morrison?" Dorothy shook her head. "Never heard that name. But Clara was private about personal matters. She'd help anyone who needed it, participate in community events, but she kept her deeper feelings to herself. The only time I ever saw her truly emotional was when students from her early teaching years would visit. She'd light up like Christmas when former students brought their children to meet her. They talked for another 20 minutes. Dorothy sharing memories of neighborhood gatherings, Clara's legendary Christmas cookies, and her habit of leaving anonymous gifts for families going through difficult times. The picture that emerged was of a woman who'd transformed her unrequited love into care for her community, who'd found purpose in nurturing other people's children when she couldn't have her own. She died about 5 years ago, Dorothy concluded, peacefully at the care facility on Maple. No family to speak of, just the whole town missing her. They had to hold her memorial service at the high school gymnasium because the church couldn't hold everyone who wanted to pay respects. Driving home, Hank felt the weight of Clara's complete story settling in his chest. She'd lived an honorable life, touched countless people, created meaning from loss in ways that demanded respect and admiration. But she'd also died alone, her great love story unknown to the very people who'd benefited from its transformation into service. The parallel to his own situation was impossible to ignore. Like Clara, he'd allowed one form of loss, Sarah's death, to become an excuse for avoiding the risk of other connections. Like Clara, he'd preserved his grief as if it were too sacred to dilute with new experiences. But unlike Clara, he still had time to write the unfinished letters, to complete the interrupted conversations, to transform regret into action. That evening, he sat at his kitchen table with a pad of writing paper, pen poised to begin a letter to Emma. The words came slowly at first, then with increasing fluency as he remembered how much he had to say to his daughter, how many years of accumulated love and pride and regret needed expression. Buck settled beside his chair, patient as always, while Hank wrote his way toward a courage that Clara's unfinished letter had finally made possible. The letter to Emma remained unfinished on Hank's kitchen table for 3 days, each attempt at honest communication stalling on the rocks of pride and accumulated hurt. Every time he approached the paper, memories would surface, Emma's voice rising in frustration during their last real conversation, his own stubborn responses, the way Sarah had tried to mediate between two people who loved each other but couldn't seem to speak the same language. It was while reorganizing Clara's belongings one more time that Hank made a discovery that would change everything. Tucked inside the pages of a small prayer book was something he'd missed during his earlier examinations, a train ticket stub. Never used, dated August 15th, 1946. The destination was St. Louis, Missouri, with a return ticket dated August 18th. Hank studied the stub, trying to understand its significance in Clara's story. The date was more than a year after James had been reported missing, but clearly before Clara had given up hope entirely. A note was paper-clipped to the ticket stub, written in Clara's familiar handwriting, for the trip to see James's aunt, who wrote that she might have news. Courage failed me at the station. What if the news confirms what I fear? Better to live with hope than certainty of loss. The simple revelation hit Hank with unexpected force. Clara had come so close to seeking answers, to pursuing closure, but had turned back at the crucial moment. She'd chosen the safety of uncertainty over the risk of devastating truth, preserving her hope at the cost of resolution. Buck padded over to where Hank sat examining the ticket, the dog's intuitive understanding of emotional distress drawing him close. Hank absently scratched behind Buck's ears, drawing comfort from the simple contact, while his mind wrestled with the implications of Clara's choice. How many times had he done the same thing? How many opportunities to bridge the gap with Emma had he abandoned at the last moment, preferring the familiar pain of estrangement to the uncertain outcome of honest conversation? He remembered the afternoon of Sarah's funeral, when Emma had approached him during the reception at the church. She'd been holding her youngest son, a toddler with Hank's own stubborn chin and Emma's intelligent eyes. For a moment, watching her struggle to balance the child while extending sympathy to mourners, Hank had felt an overwhelming urge to simply hold his grandson, to let physical affection bridge the emotional distance they'd created. But then Emma's husband had appeared, taking the child with practiced ease, and the moment had passed. Instead of pursuing connection, Hank had retreated to the familiar role of stoic patriarch, accepting condolences with dignity, while his heart broke for more than just Sarah's loss. The pattern had repeated itself dozens of times over the years. Emma would call on holidays, her voice carefully neutral, and Hank would match her tone instead of expressing the joy he felt at hearing from her. She would mention the children's achievements, good grades, school plays, little league games, and he would respond with appropriate grandfather pride while longing to be part of those ordinary moments that make up a life. He'd attended Emma's law school graduation, sitting in the back of the auditorium with Sarah, watching their daughter accept her degree with the confidence and grace they'd raised her to possess. Afterward, at the restaurant celebration, he'd wanted to tell Emma how proud he was, how her success vindicated every sacrifice they'd made to support her education. Instead, he'd made polite conversation about the ceremony and driven home feeling like a stranger at his own daughter's achievement. The worst fight had come 3 years later, when Emma announced her engagement to David, a fellow lawyer she'd met at her firm. Hank had taken one look at the young man, soft hands, expensive suit, the kind of careful politeness that suggested unfamiliarity with physical work, and made assumptions that he'd voiced with characteristic bluntness. "City boy," he'd said to Sarah later that evening. "Probably never changed a tire or fixed a fence post in his life. What's she going to do when she needs someone who can actually build something instead of just talking about it?" Sarah had responded with the patient wisdom that had marked their entire marriage. "She's not marrying him to fix fence posts, Hank. She's marrying him because he makes her laugh, because he listens to her, because he treats her like an equal partner. Maybe you should try to see what she sees, instead of focusing on what you think he lacks." But Hank had been too caught up in his own disappointment to hear the guidance. When Emma brought David to the ranch for the first time, Hank had been polite but distant, treating his future son-in-law like a visitor rather than family. The weekend had passed in stilted conversation and careful avoidance of topics that might reveal their fundamental differences. The breaking point had come when David expressed interest in learning about ranch life, asking genuine questions about cattle management and land stewardship. Instead of recognizing the gesture as an attempt at connection, Hank had interpreted it as condescension, as if a city lawyer was trying to humor the old cowboy with superficial interest. His response had been to assign David the most unpleasant chores he could think of: mucking stalls, repairing barbed wire in the heat of August afternoon, checking cattle in pastures that required long walks through rough terrain. Emma had watched her fiancé gamely attempt each task, growing more frustrated with her father's obvious testing. The explosion had come on Sunday morning, when Emma found Hank examining a fence post that David had attempted to repair the previous day. He did his best. "Dad," she'd said, her voice tight with controlled anger. His best isn't going to hold cattle, Hank had replied, not looking up from the crooked post. This isn't about the fence post. And you know it. That's when the real argument had started. 3 years of accumulated resentment, spilling out in harsh words that couldn't be taken back. Emma had accused him of being impossible to please, of judging David by standards that had nothing to do with character or kindness. Hank had responded by questioning her judgment, suggesting that she was choosing comfort over substance, running from the values that had shaped her. The fight had ended, with Emma and David leaving 2 days early, and with Sarah crying in the kitchen while Hank nursed his wounded pride in the barn. Sarah had tried to explain his mistake, to help him understand that his attempts to test David had actually been attacks on Emma's choice. But Hank had been too angry and hurt to listen. The wedding invitation had arrived 4 months later, formal and cold. Hank and Sarah had attended, sitting in the back of a city church, watching their daughter marry a man they barely knew in a ceremony that felt like a rebuke to everything they'd taught her about simplicity and authenticity. But watching Emma during the reception, seeing her laugh with genuine joy at her new husband's whispered jokes, Hank had been forced to admit that Sarah might have been right. David treated Emma with a tenderness and respect that had nothing to do with fixing fence posts and everything to do with understanding what made her happy. That realization had come too late to repair the damage. The relationship between Hank and Emma had remained polite but distant, marked by careful conversations and avoided topics. When grandchildren arrived, Hank received photos and brief updates, but he felt like a stranger observing their lives from a safe distance. Now, holding Clara's unused train ticket, Hank understood that he'd been making the same choice she had, choosing the safety of familiar pain over the risk of uncertain reconciliation. The ticket represented every phone call he'd started to make and abandoned, every letter he'd begun to write and thrown away, every moment when love had been overcome by pride. Buck stretched and yawned, drawing Hank back to the present moment. Outside, the autumn afternoon was fading toward evening, and somewhere 2 states away, his daughter was probably helping with homework or preparing dinner, living the kind of ordinary family life that Hank had always valued, but somehow failed to protect in his own family. Clara's unfinished business had become a mirror for his own, her preserved regrets a guide to what still might be salvaged. She'd run out of time to complete her story, but he still had chances to write different endings. Hank picked up the pen he'd abandoned 3 days earlier and began writing to Emma again, this time with Clara's courage and her regrets both, guiding his words toward honesty he'd been avoiding for too long. Hank was reaching for another envelope when his fingers encountered something unexpected. At the very bottom of the shoebox, a manila envelope that had been sealed and placed beneath all the other contents. Unlike the personal letters and photographs, this envelope felt official, its weight suggesting important documents rather than emotional correspondence. Buck lifted his head from his afternoon nap, sensing the change in Hank's energy as he carefully opened the envelope. Inside were several folded documents, a birth certificate, adoption papers, and a brief handwritten note on hospital letterhead. The birth certificate made Hank's world tilt on its axis. Baby girl Morrison, born September 14th, 1947, to Clara Elizabeth Hartwell Morrison at Cedar Falls General Hospital. Father listed as James Patrick Morrison, deceased. Weight 6 pounds 4 ounces. Hank stared at the document, his mind struggling to reconcile this revelation with everything he thought he'd understood about Clara's story. She hadn't just been a woman writing letters to a lost love. She'd been a mother, a widow, someone whose life had been far more complex than her preserved correspondence had revealed. The adoption papers were dated 3 months later, December 15th, 1947. Baby girl Morrison had been placed with Robert and Helen Garrett of Chicago, Illinois, and renamed Susan Elizabeth Garrett. The brief note from the hospital social worker provided devastating context. Miss Hartwell feels unable to provide for the child's needs as an unmarried mother. She wishes the child to have the stable family life she cannot offer alone. The handwritten note on hospital letterhead was in Clara's familiar script, but the words were unlike anything in her letters to James. My dearest daughter, I hope someday you'll understand that giving you away was the most loving thing I could do. I'm not strong enough to raise you alone, and you deserve parents who can give you everything I cannot. Know that you were wanted, that you were created from the deepest love I've ever known, and that not a day will pass that I don't think of you. Hank set the papers down with trembling hands, his entire understanding of Clara's story crumbling and reforming around this new information. She hadn't been writing to James from loneliness or romantic fantasy. She'd been writing to the father of her child, sharing news he would never hear about a daughter he would never hold. The implications cascaded through his mind like dominoes falling. Clara's decision to never marry made sense now. She'd already given her heart completely, not just to James, but to their daughter. Her dedication to teaching took on new meaning. She'd been caring for other people's children while mourning the loss of her own. Her quiet life, her reserved nature, her careful privacy, all of it had been shaped by carrying a secret that could have destroyed her reputation in a small 1940s town. Buck approached, pressing his warm body against Hank's leg as if sensing the emotional earthquake his master was experiencing. Hank absently petted the dog while his mind raced through the mathematics of Clara's sacrifice. She would have been 21 when the baby was born, alone and facing social disgrace in an era that offered little support for unmarried mothers. The choice to place her daughter for adoption hadn't been made from lack of love, but from an abundance of it. She wanted more for her child than she could provide. Hank thought of Emma, of the fierce protectiveness he'd felt from the moment she was born, the way every decision had been filtered through what would be best for her future. He tried to imagine making Clara's choice, giving up his child to strangers because he believed they could offer better opportunities. And the thought made his chest ache with sympathetic grief. The timeline of Clara's letters took on new significance now. Those early letters, written in the months after James was reported missing, would have been composed while Clara was pregnant, carrying his child while hoping against hope that he might somehow return. The later letters, the ones that spoke of acceptance and finding purpose, had been written by a woman who'd experienced motherhood and loss in ways that few people could understand. Hank picked up the adoption papers again, studying the names of the adoptive parents, Robert and Helen Garrett. The address was in a prosperous Chicago neighborhood, suggesting people with resources and stability. Clara had chosen carefully, giving her daughter the best future she could arrange. But what had happened to that daughter? Susan Elizabeth Garrett would be nearly 77 years old now, possibly still alive, possibly unaware that her birth mother had preserved her father's memory through decades of unread letters. Did she know about James Morrison, about the love story that had created her life? Did she wonder about the woman who'd given her away? The questions multiplied faster than Hank could process them. Had Clara ever tried to contact her daughter? Had she followed Susan's life from a distance, celebrating achievements she couldn't share, mourning struggles she couldn't ease? Or had she maintained complete separation, treating the adoption as a closed chapter that couldn't be reopened without causing pain? Hank found himself thinking of Emma's children, his grandchildren whom he barely knew. He had photographs from Christmas cards, brief updates about school activities and summer camps, but he'd missed the daily moments that build relationships, bedtime stories, homework help, the kind of casual intimacy that creates lasting bonds. Clara had been completely cut off from her daughter's life, but Hank's separation from his grandchildren was self-imposed, maintained by pride and stubborn refusal to bridge the gap with Emma. The parallel was too obvious to ignore. Clara had sacrificed her relationship with her daughter for the child's welfare, believing that love sometimes required letting go. Hank had sacrificed his relationship with his daughter for his own pride, believing that being right was more important than being connected. Buck whined softly, pressing closer as if trying to anchor Hank to the present moment. The dog's simple presence was grounding, a reminder that love didn't always require complicated analysis. Sometimes it just was. Steady and uncomplicated and immediate. Hank carefully returned the documents to their envelope, handling them with the reverence due to someone else's most precious secrets. But as he moved to close the shoebox, another thought struck him with startling clarity. What if Susan Garrett was still alive? What if she'd spent her life wondering about her origins, about the circumstances that led to her adoption? What if she had questions that only Clara's preserved letters could answer? The idea felt both presumptuous and necessary. He had no right to intrude on Susan's life, no authority to share information that Clara had kept private. But he also had a responsibility to the story he'd accidentally inherited, to the love and loss that had been preserved through chance and circumstance. For the first time since finding the letters, Hank wondered if his discovery had been truly accidental. Maybe some stories demanded to be completed, maybe some secrets needed to be shared, maybe some love needed to find its way across decades of separation to reach the people it was meant to touch. The afternoon was aging toward evening, and Hank realized he'd been sitting with Clara's revelation for hours, his mind cycling through implications and possibilities. The letter to Emma still lay unfinished on the table, but now it seemed part of a larger pattern of interrupted conversations and severed connections that demanded attention. Clara's story had become more than a mystery to solve. It was a map of choices and consequences, a guide to understanding how love could survive even when its objects were lost or distant or seemingly beyond reach. She'd loved James completely, mourned him faithfully, and given their daughter the best life she could arrange, all while maintaining a dignity and grace that had earned the respect of an entire community. But she'd also died alone. Her great love story unknown to the very people who'd benefited from its transformation into service. Her daughter somewhere in the world, unaware of the preserved evidence of her parents' devotion. Hank looked at his unfinished letter to Emma, then at Clara's carefully preserved correspondence, and understood that some stories could still be completed if someone had the courage to write the missing chapters. Clara's daughter deserved to know about the love that created her, just as Emma deserved to know that her father's pride had never diminished his love. The shoebox sat before him like a responsibility and an opportunity, containing not just the archaeology of past love, but the blueprint for present action. Clara's choices had been shaped by her circumstances, but Hank's choices could still be shaped by wisdom learned from her preserved regrets. Buck settled beside his chair with a contented sigh, and Hank reached for his pen with new determination to finish what Clara had started. Not just her letters, but the work of love that required courage to complete. The next morning found Hank at the Cedar Falls Care Facility, a modern building that tried to soften the reality of its purpose with cheerful colors and artificial flowers. Margaret Stillwater had provided Clara's final address after some gentle persuasion and a promise that Hank's intentions were honorable. "I remember Miss Hartwell," said Nancy Chen, the administrator who'd agreed to meet with Hank. "She was here for about 18 months before she passed. Lovely woman, very quiet. The staff was quite fond of her." Hank explained his discovery of the letters, watching Nancy's expression shift from professional courtesy to genuine interest, and then to something approaching wonder. "She never had visitors," Nancy continued softly. "No family that we knew of. It was one of the sad aspects of her case. Here was this woman who'd obviously led a full life, taught hundreds of children, contributed to her community, but she died essentially alone." The words hit Hank with unexpected force. Clara had spent her final months surrounded by kind strangers, her real history known to no one. Her great love story locked away in a storage unit that would remain sealed for years after her death. "Did she leave any personal effects?" Hank asked. Nancy nodded, rising from her desk. "Actually, yes. We have a small box of items that were in her room. No one ever claimed them, and we were planning to dispose of them soon. Would you like to see what's there? The box was smaller than a shoebox, containing the modest possessions of someone who'd lived carefully and traveled light. A few photographs of former students, a well-worn Bible, reading glasses, and tucked at the bottom, a plastic hospital bracelet from her admission. Clara Hartwell, Dobiles, Kitton, 1925, room 247, the bracelet read in faded print. Such a simple summary of a complex life, reduced to name and birth date and a room, number where she'd spent her final days. But it was what Nancy said next that stopped Hank's heart. She did mention someone. Once, the administrator said carefully. A social worker asked about family contacts when Miss Hartwell first arrived, and she mentioned having placed a daughter for adoption years ago. She said she'd tried to find her once, in the 1980s, but the adoption records were sealed and the family had moved. She seemed to have made peace with never knowing what happened. Hank felt the weight of missed connections settling in his chest. Clara had tried to reach out to her daughter, had attempted to bridge the decades of separation, but had been defeated by bureaucracy and circumstance. She died wondering about Susan, just as Susan might be living without knowing about Clara's preserved love. Did she leave any instructions about finding the daughter? Nancy shook her head. I'm sorry. She was very private about family matters. But she did say once that she hoped her daughter had been happy, had found good parents and a good life. She seemed more concerned with that than with finding her. The drive home passed in contemplative silence, Buck riding with his head out the window, while Hank's mind wrestled with the expanding scope of Clara's story. What had begun as simple curiosity about abandoned love letters had become a complex web of relationships, choices, and consequences that stretched across decades and touched multiple generations. That afternoon, Hank called Margaret at the library with a new research request. If Susan Garrett was still alive, there might be public records that could help locate her, marriage certificates that would reveal a current name, addresses, perhaps even children who might want to know about their grandmother's preserved correspondence. Margaret's enthusiasm for the project had grown with each revelation. I have a friend who works in Chicago records, she told Hank. Let me make some calls, see what we can find. It's a long shot, but stranger things have happened. While waiting for Margaret's research, Hank found himself drawn repeatedly to his unfinished letter to Emma. Clara's story had become a lens through which his own relationships appeared in sharp focus, highlighting the patterns of avoidance and missed opportunities that had shaped his interactions with his daughter. He remembered the last time Emma had visited the ranch, 2 years after Sarah's funeral. She'd come alone, leaving David and the children in Denver for what she'd described as a chance to talk without distractions. Hank had been pleased by her attention, hopeful that they might finally address the distance that had grown between them. But when the conversation had turned to difficult topics, his isolation, her concerns about his health, the possibility of him moving closer to family, Hank had retreated into defensive stubbornness. Emma had tried to explain her worry, her desire to help, but Hank had heard criticism instead of love, control instead of care. The visit had ended with polite stalemate, both of them frustrated by their inability to communicate effectively. Emma had returned to Denver with the same careful distance intact, and Hank had spent months afterward rehearsing better responses to conversations that were already over. Buck wandered into the kitchen, settling beside Hank's chair with the patient attention that had marked their partnership for years. The dog's presence was grounding, a reminder that some relationships transcended the complications that plagued human connections. Buck loved without conditions, forgave without effort, and remained present even when presence wasn't particularly pleasant. "What do you think, boy?" Hank asked, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Am I being a fool, trying to fix other people's broken stories when I can't fix my own?" Buck's tail thumped against the floor, a response that Hank chose to interpret as encouragement. That evening, Margaret called with preliminary results from her Chicago contact. "We found her," she said without preamble. Susan Garrett married Robert Mills in 1968, became Susan Mills. They had 2 children, both living. Robert died about 10 years ago, but Susan is still alive, living in a retirement community outside Phoenix. The news sent an unexpected jolt through Hank's system. Clara's daughter was real, alive, perhaps reachable. The abstract notion of connecting past and present suddenly became concrete possibility, fraught with potential for both healing and disruption. "There's more," Margaret continued. "My friend found an interesting newspaper article from the Chicago Tribune, dated 1985. Susan Mills was quoted in a story about adoption reunification services. She was looking for her birth mother, a woman named Clara from Cedar Falls, Iowa. The synchronicity was staggering. Clara and Susan had been searching for each other at the same time, separated by geography and sealed records, each wondering about the other while living parallel lives of curiosity and longing. She was looking for Clara in 1985, Hank repeated, his mind calculating the timing. That's exactly when Clara tried to find her. They missed each other by bureaucratic procedures. Looks like it. The article mentions that Susan had been searching for several years, working with various agencies. She talked about wanting to understand her origins, to know about her birth parents' circumstances. There's a quote here, "I don't need anything from her except understanding. I just want to know that I was wanted, that the decision to place me for adoption came from love rather than rejection." Hank closed his eyes, thinking of Clara's preserved letters, her decades of faithful correspondence with a ghost, her careful note to the daughter she'd given away. Susan had been searching for exactly what Clara had preserved, evidence of love, proof that she'd been wanted, understanding of choices made from necessity rather than abandonment. "Margaret, do you think we should contact her?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "That's not really my decision to make, Hank, but I will say this. Some stories demand completion. Sometimes the universe conspires to bring information to the people who need it most." After hanging up, Hank sat with Buck in the gathering dusk, watching shadows lengthen across the pastures he'd worked for decades. The weight of responsibility felt enormous. He held the key to questions that Susan Mills had been asking for 40 years. But he also held the power to disrupt whatever peace she'd made with unanswered history. The parallel to his own situation was impossible to ignore. Emma had been reaching out in her way, trying to maintain connection despite their differences. While he'd been preserving his pride like Clara had preserved her letters, carefully, faithfully, and ultimately without purpose, if no one ever received the message. The hospital bracelet from Clara's final days lay on the kitchen table, a reminder of mortality and the urgency of connection. Clara had run out of time to complete her story, but Hank still had chances to write different endings for both Susan's questions and his own relationship with Emma. Buck stretched and padded to his food bowl, the simple rhythms of daily care, providing structure for increasingly complex, emotional territory. As Hank followed, preparing the dog's dinner while his mind wrestled with decisions about past and present, he understood that some choices couldn't be postponed indefinitely. Clara's letters had waited in darkness for years, but they'd been discovered at exactly the moment when their message could do the most good. Perhaps that was how love worked, preserving itself through time and chance until it found the hearts that needed it most. Tomorrow, Hank decided, he would make the phone calls that courage demanded. To Susan Mills in Phoenix, to share the evidence of her mother's love, and to Emma in Denver, to share his own preserved affection that had been waiting too long for expression. The kitchen grew dark around them, but Hank felt lighter than he had in years, as if Clara's story had given him permission to complete his own, interrupted, conversations with the people who mattered most. Hank stared at the phone for 20 minutes before finding the courage to dial Emma's number. Buck lay at his feet, providing silent moral support as his master gathered the nerve for a conversation that had been years in the making. The pressed flower from Clara's letter sat on the table beside him, a fragile reminder that love could survive decades of separation if someone was willing to preserve it carefully. The phone rang 3 times before Emma's voice answered. cautious and slightly breathless. "Hello, Emma, it's Dad." The pause that followed felt like an eternity. Hank could hear children's voices in the background, normal family sounds that reminded him of everything he'd been missing. "Dad, is everything okay?" Her tone was immediately concerned, and Hank realized that unexpected calls from him could only mean emergency or crisis in Emma's experience. "I'm fine, sweetheart." "Buck's fine." "Everything's fine." He paused, struggling for words that had seemed clearer in his mind. "I called because I wanted to talk to you. Really talk, not just the polite conversation we usually have." Another pause, longer this time. "Okay," Emma said carefully. "What's going on?" Hank found himself looking at Clara's photograph, drawing strength from her patient expression. "Something happened recently that made me think about us, about the things I've never said. I found some letters, Emma. Love letters that were never sent. From a woman who ran out of time to say what mattered most. Dad, I'm not sure I understand." "Her name was Clara," Hank continued, the words coming easier now. "She wrote letters to a soldier who died in World War II, but she never mailed them. She kept writing for years, telling him about her life, her hopes, her regrets. I found them in a storage unit, and reading them made me realize how many things I've never told you." Emma's voice softened slightly. "What kind of things?" "How proud I am of you. How sorry I am for the way I treated David when you first brought him home. How much I miss having you in my life. Not just the polite phone calls, but really being part of your family." Hank's voice caught slightly. "How much I love you, and how afraid I've been that saying so wouldn't matter anymore." The silence stretched between them, filled with years of careful distance and accumulated hurt. When Emma spoke again, her voice was quieter, more vulnerable. "Dad, why are you telling me this now, after all this time?" "Because Clara never got the chance to say these things to the people she loved. She died alone, Emma, with all her love letters locked away where no one could find them. Her daughter spent 40 years wondering if she'd been wanted, if her birth mother had loved her, and all that time the proof was sitting in a box that nobody knew existed. She had a daughter." Emma's lawyer instincts engaged, despite the emotional territory they were navigating. Hank explained about the birth certificate, the adoption papers, Clara's careful note to the child she'd given away. As he spoke, he could hear Emma's breathing change, could sense her beginning to understand the parallels he was drawing. "She spent her whole life loving people who couldn't know about it," Hank said. "And I realized I've been doing something similar, keeping my love for you and the grandchildren locked away behind pride and stubbornness and fear that it might not be welcome." "Of course it's welcome," Emma said, and for the first time in years. Her voice carried real emotion instead of careful politeness. "Dad, of course your love is welcome, but you've been so distant, so hard to reach. I've tried, I know you have. I know, and I'm sorry. I've been protecting myself instead of protecting what matters most." Hank looked at the pressed flower again, remembering Clara's words about love requiring courage. The woman who wrote these letters, she never got to see her daughter grow up, never got to know her grandchildren. She preserved her love in letters that nobody read until after she was gone. "And you don't want that to happen to us," Emma said, understanding. "I don't want to die with everything important left unsaid. I don't want you to wonder if I was proud of the life you built, if I loved David and the children, if I understood why you made the choices you made. Because I am proud, Emma. I love your family, and I understand that you built something beautiful that I was too stubborn to appreciate." Emma was crying now, soft sounds that carried through the phone line like a bridge across the distance between them. "Dad, I've missed you so much. The kids ask about Grandpa Hank sometimes, and I never know what to tell them. Tell them I'm an old fool who forgot that being right isn't as important as being family," Hank said. "Tell them I want to know them, if you'll let me try." "Of course I'll let you try. We all want that." The conversation continued for another hour, touching on years of accumulated hurt and hope. Emma talked about David's patient attempts to win Hank's approval, about the children's curiosity, about their distant grandfather, about her own struggle to balance respect for her father with protection of her family. Hank shared more of Clara's story, using her preserved love as a template for expressing his own feelings. The letters had become a bridge, allowing them to discuss difficult emotions through the safety of someone else's experience. When they finally hung up, Hank felt lighter than he had since Sarah's death. The conversation hadn't solved everything. There were still years of distance to bridge, relationships to rebuild, trust to restore. But they'd made a beginning, found a way to speak honestly about love that had been preserved in silence for too long. Buck stretched and yawned, tail wagging with the simple satisfaction of sensing his master's improved mood. The pressed flower lay on the table, its faded petals a reminder that some things could survive any amount of time if they were tended with care. Clara's love had found its purpose at last, not just in the story it told, but in the courage it had given him to tell his own. 3 days after their phone conversation, Hank sat at his kitchen table with a blank sheet of paper, finally ready to write the letter he'd been composing in his mind for years. Clara's correspondence had taught him that some words were too important for casual conversation. They required the careful consideration that came with pen and paper, the weight of permanent expression. Buck dozed beside his chair, content in the knowledge that his master had found purpose beyond daily routine. The shoebox of Clara's letters sat nearby, no longer a mystery to solve, but a source of inspiration for completing his own interrupted story. "Dear Emma," Hank wrote, then paused to consider how Clara had always begun her letters to James. Her salutations had carried such tenderness, such hope, despite the absence of any recipient. Hank wanted his words to carry the same weight of preserved love, finally finding expression. "I've been reading the letters of a woman who spent her life writing to someone who couldn't write back, and I realized I've been doing something similar, keeping my love for you locked away instead of sharing it while it could still matter. This letter is my attempt to follow her example of courage, to say things that are long overdue." The words came slowly at first, then with increasing fluency, as Hank allowed himself to express feelings he'd protected for too long. He wrote about watching her grow up, about the pride he'd felt when she'd excelled in school, about the fear that had motivated his attempts to prepare her for a world he'd seen as dangerous and unpredictable. "I know now that I tried to protect you by making you strong, but I ended up making you feel like my approval was conditional on being the person I thought you should be, rather than the person you were becoming. I was wrong, Emma. You didn't need to be stronger or different or more like me. You needed to know that you were loved exactly as you were." He wrote about David, acknowledging the good man his son-in-law had always been, admitting that his initial resistance had come from fear of losing his daughter, rather than legitimate concerns about her choice. "David makes you happy in ways I never understood how to value," he wrote. "He listens when you speak, supports your dreams, treats you as an equal partner. These are gifts I should have celebrated instead of questioning." The letter continued for several pages, touching on the grandchildren he barely knew, the holidays he'd missed, the ordinary moments that build relationships over time. Hank wrote about his isolation after Sarah's death, about how grief had become an excuse for avoiding the risk of new hurt, about the way loneliness had made him protective of what little connection remained. Reading Clara's letters taught me that love doesn't diminish when it's shared. It grows. She loved James completely, but also found room to love their daughter, her students, her community. I've been hoarding my love like it was finite, when the truth is that loving you and your family would only make me richer, not poorer. As he wrote, Hank found himself thinking of Clara's unfinished letter, the one that had ended mid-sentence when courage had failed her. He was determined not to repeat her hesitation, to complete thoughts that needed expression regardless of their difficulty. "I know I can't undo the years of distance between us, but I hope I can still participate in the years ahead. I want to know your children as individuals, not just as names in Christmas cards. I want to support your career, celebrate your successes, be someone you can count on, instead of someone you have to manage carefully." The letter concluded with an invitation, Would Emma and her family consider visiting the ranch for Thanksgiving? Not for a formal reconciliation, but for a chance to build new patterns of connection, to let the children experience the land that had shaped their grandfather, to create memories that could bridge the gap between past hurt and future hope. "I'll understand if you need more time," Hank wrote. "But I hope you'll give us a chance to discover who we can be to each other now, rather than remaining trapped by who we've been in the past." He signed the letter with love, sealed it carefully, and drove to town immediately to mail it before he could second-guess his courage. The act of sending felt significant. Unlike Clara's preserved correspondence, this letter would reach its intended recipient, would carry his words across the distance to someone who could respond. Emma called 2 days later, her voice warm with emotion and possibility. "Dad, I got your letter. I've read it 3 times and David's read it twice. We'd love to come for Thanksgiving. The kids are excited about seeing the ranch, and I'm excited about seeing you." The conversation that followed was different from their phone call 3 days earlier, less tentative, more natural, marked by the easy flow that comes when people stop protecting themselves from each other. Emma talked about her work, about the children's activities, about David's recent promotion. Hank shared details about the ranch, about Buck's latest adventures, about his plans for showing his grandchildren the places that had mattered most to their grandmother. They discussed practical arrangements, travel dates, sleeping arrangements, dietary restrictions, but underneath the logistics was a current of anticipation that neither had felt in years. The prospect of reunion carried both excitement and nervousness, but it was honest anxiety rather than the careful distance that had marked their previous interactions. "Dad," Emma said as their conversation wound down, "thank you for writing that letter. It meant everything to read those words, to know that you've been thinking about us even when we felt so far apart." "Thank you for reading it with an open heart," Hank replied. "Your grandmother always said that the best conversations start with someone being brave enough to speak truth, even when it's difficult." After hanging up, Hank sat with Buck in the comfortable silence of the kitchen, feeling the satisfaction that comes from completing important work. Clara's letters had taught him that preserved love could wait years for the right moment to surface. But shared love could create immediate connection across any distance. The reconciliation letter lay in memory now, rather than on paper, its words already traveling toward their intended recipient, carrying decades of accumulated affection, finally given proper expression. For the first time since Sarah's death, Hank looked forward to the holidays with genuine excitement rather than dutiful obligation. Clara's story would continue to unfold. He still planned to contact Susan Mills, to share the evidence of her mother's love. But his own story had found its turning point, the moment when courage overcame pride and love overcame fear. Outside, autumn was settling deeper into the landscape, but inside, something felt like spring, fresh possibilities emerging from ground that had seemed too hard for new growth. Thanksgiving morning arrived, with the kind of crystalline clarity that made promises feel permanent. Hank stood at his kitchen window, watching Emma's rental car navigate the gravel drive, while his grandchildren pressed their faces against the windows, eager for their first real look at the ranch that had shaped their family history. Buck waited beside him, tail wagging with the excitement that came from sensing important arrivals. The dog had been Hank's constant companion through the weeks of preparation, helping rearrange furniture, accompanying trips to town for groceries, providing moral support as Hank wrestled with the nervousness that preceded reunion. "Here we go, boy," Hank murmured, straightening his shirt one final time before stepping onto the porch. Emma emerged from the car first, and Hank felt his breath catch at how much she resembled Sarah in the morning light. She'd inherited her mother's grace, her quiet strength, and the way she immediately began organizing her family's arrival spoke to the competence that had always made him proud. David climbed out next, extending his hand with the same careful politeness he'd shown years earlier. But now Hank could see past his own prejudices to recognize the genuine warmth in his son-in-law's expression. The children tumbled out after their parents. 10-year-old Michael, with Hank's stubborn chin, and 8-year-old Sarah with Emma's intelligent eyes. Grandpa Hank. Young Sarah called, running toward him with the fearless enthusiasm of childhood. "Is that Buck? Mom said he's the smartest dog in the whole world." Hank knelt to receive his granddaughter's hug, feeling years of distance collapse in a single embrace. Buck approached cautiously, allowing himself to be petted while taking the measure of these new humans who clearly belonged to his master's pack. "He's not quite the smartest," Hank said, winking at Sarah, "but he's certainly the most patient. Would you like to help me show him the chickens after lunch?" The morning passed in a blur of introductions and reconnections. Michael wanted to see the barn, to understand how the ranch operated, to hear stories about the cattle that had once filled the pastures. David asked thoughtful questions about land management and sustainable farming, his interest genuine rather than polite. Emma moved through the house with the easy familiarity of someone returning home, pointing out photographs to her children and sharing memories that Hank had feared were lost. But it was during the quiet moments, when young Sarah fell asleep against his shoulder while he read to her, when Michael helped him fix a loose fence post with serious concentration, that Hank felt the true weight of what had been restored. These weren't just visits with strangers who happened to share his blood. These were relationships with real people who wanted to know him as much as he wanted to know them. Over dinner, Emma asked about Clara's letters, and Hank found himself sharing the complete story, the discovery in the storage unit, the research into Clara's life, the shocking revelation about her daughter, and his eventual contact with Susan Mills in Phoenix. "You found her daughter?" David asked, his legal background engaging with the implications. "After all these years?" Hank nodded. "Susan Mills, age 77, living in a retirement community outside Phoenix. I called her last week, told her about the letters and the birth certificate. She cried for 20 minutes, then asked if she could come to Cedar Falls to see where her mother lived." Emma leaned forward, invested in the story. "Is she coming?" "Next month. She's bringing her son and daughter-in-law. Wants to visit Clara's grave, see the house where she grew up, read the letters her father never received." Hank smiled, remembering Susan's voice breaking with emotion during their conversation. She said she'd spent her whole life wondering if she'd been loved or abandoned. The letters answered questions she'd been carrying for 70 years. The children listened with the fascination that came from understanding that their grandfather had been part of something important, something that connected past and present in ways that seemed almost magical. Young Sarah asked if she could see Clara's photograph, studying the image with the serious attention she gave to all important matters. "She looks kind," Sarah pronounced finally, "like someone who would be a good teacher." "She was," Hank agreed. "And now her daughter knows that too." Later that evening, after the children had been tucked into their beds and David and Emma were settled in the living room with coffee, Hank brought out Clara's letters for the last time. He'd decided to donate them to the Cedar Falls Historical Society, along with the jukebox and other personal items from the storage unit. Clara's story deserved to be preserved properly, shared with future generations who might draw strength from her example of love, persevering through impossible circumstances. "Dad," Emma said softly, "I'm proud of what you did for Clara and her daughter. It took courage to reach out to strangers, to take responsibility for someone else's unfinished business." "It taught me about my own unfinished business," Hank replied. "Clara spent her whole life writing letters that never got sent, and I was doing something similar, keeping my love for you locked away instead of sharing it. Her story gave me permission to take the risk of reaching out." David set down his coffee cup, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes it takes outside perspective to see our own patterns clearly. I'm grateful that Clara's story helped bring our family back together." The weekend passed too quickly, filled with small adventures and ordinary moments that felt precious for their long absence. Hank taught Michael to whittle, showed Sarah how to gather eggs from the neighbor's chickens, took the whole family on walks through the pastures where Emma had learned to ride. Buck appointed himself guardian of the children, following them with patient devotion and accepting their enthusiastic affection with canine grace. On Sunday morning, as the family prepared for departure, Emma pulled Hank aside for a private conversation. "This has been wonderful," she said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "The kids want to come back for Christmas, if you're willing to have us." "I'm more than willing," Hank replied. "I've got 70 years of grandfather duties to catch up on," Emma laughed, hugging him with the same intensity she'd shown as a child. "We'll make sure you get plenty of practice." As the rental car disappeared down the gravel drive, Hank stood on his porch with Buck beside him, feeling simultaneously empty and full. The house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence, expectant rather than resigned, pregnant with possibility rather than heavy with regret. Over the following weeks, Hank threw himself into preparation for Christmas with energy that surprised everyone, including himself. He repaired the guest rooms, updated the kitchen, and even convinced himself to learn basic computer skills so he could video chat with the grandchildren between visits. Buck observed these activities with the amused tolerance of a dog who understood that humans sometimes needed complex projects to express simple emotions. Clara's story had come full circle. Susan Mills visited in November, spending 3 days in Cedar Falls, reading her mother's letters, visiting her grave, and meeting the man who'd preserved her family history through accident and determination. She wept over the pressed flower, laughed at Clara's descriptions of small-town life, and marveled at the depth of love that had survived decades of separation. "She never stopped loving my father," Susan told Hank as they sat in the cemetery where Clara was buried. "And she never stopped loving me, even though she had to let me go. These letters are the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." The Historical Society accepted Clara's collection with reverence, planning an exhibit about love and loss during wartime that would honor both her story and the broader experiences of her generation. Clara's jukebox, restored to working condition, would play songs from the 1940s while visitors read excerpts from her correspondence. As winter settled over the ranch, Hank found himself looking forward to each day with anticipation he hadn't felt in years. There were phone calls with Emma, video chats with the grandchildren, letters to write and relationships to nurture. Buck grew sleeker and more energetic, responding to his master's renewed engagement with life. On Christmas Eve, as Hank prepared for his family's arrival, he paused to look at the new photograph on his mantel, himself, Emma and Buck on Thanksgiving Day, all of them laughing at something Michael had said. It was a picture of people who belonged together, who'd found their way back to connection despite the years of distance. Clara's letters had taught him that love preserved in silence could wait decades for the right moment to surface. But love shared in the present could transform lives immediately. Her story had ended with solitude, but it had given him the courage to write a different ending for his own. Buck stretched and padded to the door, ready for their evening walk. As they stepped into the crisp December air, Hank felt the deep satisfaction that comes from completing important work. Clara's love had finally reached its intended destinations, and his own love had found its voice again. Some stories, he realized, are meant to be discovered by the people who most need their lessons. Clara's letters had been waiting in that storage unit for exactly the right moment, for exactly the right person to understand their message and carry it forward. Tomorrow his family would arrive, and the house would fill with laughter and conversation and the beautiful chaos of people who cared about each other. But tonight, walking with Buck under stars that had witnessed all the love stories ever written, Hank felt the quiet contentment of a man who'd learned to share his heart before it was too late.